All right, we'll go ahead and get started with a lecture on Chapter 1 in our new textbook, which is an introduction to web programming. You guys are going to see a lot of concepts you've seen before, at least in web development world, web programming. So some of this will definitely be review. You guys will hit some concepts. You're going to say, yeah, that seems familiar. And then some of this will be new for you, brand new. And that's the second part of this, which is what is this ASP.NET Core MVC? What are all those words? What are all those letters? What do they mean and how do they work? And what's their significance here? What do they mean? Some of these objectives, we'll go through them quickly. What are the components of a web app? I mean, kind of broadly, we can overgeneralize, right? You can say the front end, the back end, in the middle, if you will, the components of a web app. And then we're going to break down components of a URL and how that's going to work over here. What are the components of a URL and like how they work in MVC land? For the most part today, this is distinguished between static pages and dynamic web pages. Everything's dynamic nowadays. We're going to talk about web servers, application servers, and database servers. And what are their roles here? Internet versus intranet, that's kind of old language. Internet obviously is we'll get into the difference between those two. We'll get into HTTP request versus response. Remember the rec and res, request and response, and what's referred to as a round trip. When a client makes a request, they get a response. That's a round trip. We'll get into the MVC pattern, the model view controller pattern, and then what are the strengths and weaknesses of MVC? What are the strengths and weaknesses of MVC? That's kind of 7. How the pattern can improve development, but that's its strengths, but then what are its weaknesses as well? Different programming models that we can use for .NET applications. So MVC, it turns out in the Microsoft world, MVC is not the only way for building web applications. Okay, there's actually newer approaches that we're going to bring into this class. So we're not only doing MVC, but we're doing MVC plus some additional models, if you will. And then we're going to talk about the different versions of .NET. That's what Bullet 9 is really about. We'll get into middleware and what middleware is and how it works. We'll get into application state and maintaining state on the client or on the server. And then we're going to talk about this big concept in this world, which is coding by convention. It really boils down to this coding by convention is that there's a lot of assumptions that are made in .NET MVC that you have to work within these assumptions, and you have to basically follow the rules. And that's what these conventions are. So the first bullet is like, what are the parts of a web application? And you're going to see some slides that look like this and have the little icon notebook LM. So these are slides that I have updated. Okay, this is theory that I have gone out, kind of done a little updating to these slideshows, but I'm not a graphic artist and I'm not really good at graphics. And so I used Notebook LM. You guys familiar with Notebook LM? Yes, no? No? Just another tool, but this one can do graphics. And so just a little heads up. These are the ones that I've kind of updated.
Notebook LM.
Notebook LM. It's a Google product. Yeah. Okay, so the front end in the MERN stack, you guys knew the front end was in React. React is so popular. React was so popular that Microsoft made a competitor. Does anyone know the competitor to React on the Microsoft world?
Ruby on Rails?
No, that's something else. Good guess though. It's called Blazor. Blazor is a thing. Okay, fun word, I guess. A suit blazer. I don't know where they came up with the word blazer. Blazor is a component-based front end in .NET, and it was purely built as a competitor to React. React is so popular, though. React is so popular that the trend that I've seen is that even over here in the .NET world, .NET developers are still building front ends in React. Okay, so even though Blazor exists over here, and we will learn some Blazor in this class, you very well may and you can build your front end in React. The back end, though, if you really look at, I guess you could call this the middle, oftentimes the web and the application server, they're also referred to as the back end. So even though this slide calls it the middle, sometimes it's all blended together. The truth is this slide is just a generalization, and it is far too general because there's many, many layers to this middle tier. Okay, so broadly speaking, you could call it the middle, you could call it the back, but this is where your C# that you're going to write, that's where this lives. It says this is where .NET lives. Okay, so in the old days, you would have what's called a web server, and you would have an application server, and those were two different pieces of software. In the Windows world, that was called IIS. IIS was the application server, and then you had, IIS was the web server, and then you would just have what's called .NET Framework, which was an application server. Okay, that's the old days. Nowadays, it's all together under one hood. The web server and the application server are now one product, and that's called Kestrel. K-E-S, it says right here, K-E-S-T-R-E-L. And Kestrel is both the web server and the application server that will run your C#. That's where your application logic exists. Okay, so Kestrel is the web server and the application server. And it says this is the core of our journey. And so Kestrel runs, MVC. It runs .NET. Kestrel runs some other products that we'll learn about. And then we have the database, right? So in the MERN stack, you guys will remember Express. Express was the web and the application server, just like Kestrel. Okay? So just drawing the connection, we had React, that's Blazor. But if you don't like Blazor, you could still use React for your front end, because these things are compatible. Okay, you could put a different front end on a .NET back end, and that would work. You could put a JavaScript front end on a .NET back end. And I would even say that's the trend in 25 and 2026. When it comes to the database, in the Microsoft world, we are going to use Microsoft SQL Server. Now, the other one that's right here, Postgres, that's actually, when we, remember those developer surveys I show you guys? Postgres is actually really popular, right? So if you're doing just like, if your technology, what is done in this class is like just pure Microsoft stack. But if I'm just going to go purely what's popular, if I'm going pure Microsoft stack, I'm doing Blazor on the front end, I'm doing Kestrel .NET on the middle, and I'm doing Microsoft SQL Server on the back end. That's the most pure Microsoft stack, and that's really what we're just mainly, we're going to focus on the Microsoft stack, Microsoft technologies. But if I'm going to tell you what's the most popular today, it's not full Microsoft. You call that being in a silo, the Microsoft silo. What's popular is not the Microsoft silo. What's popular is React on the front end, Kestrel on the middle, and then Postgres on the database. So just being aware of what's out there, I think, is important. Okay, so when it comes to the components of the web app, they're the same components. You've heard of them before. They're new pieces of software for the same components. You've seen those components before, for sure. Okay, now when it comes to the 4 parts of a URL, you guys have all seen URLs. Okay, and how do they work over here? The first piece is HTTPS. And you're going to see that this is the secure 2025 standard. Okay? You do not make a website that's not HTTPS in 26. Okay? If you make a website that's not HTTPS, the first thing that's going to happen when a user goes to that website is they're going to get a big fat warning, and it says, this website is not secure. Are you sure you want to go here? So you got to fix that. You cannot have a website that's not HTTPS. Now, thankfully, I just want to, as a one-off, right? HTTPS, we know HTTP allows us to have verbs. What do those verbs do? It allows us to get a resource. HTTP get, HTTP post, HTTP put, right? These verbs are built into the protocol that allows us to exchange information back and forth across the internet. The internet being the cables and the routers and the switches that make up the global internet. Okay, so the web is built with software that traverses the internet, right? That is the physical cabling and the routers. Okay, so there's a difference between the web and the internet. HTTPS is the protocol that allows us to send information across the internet, to get HTML files and the like. I wanted to show you guys something that I did very recently when I said, hey, it is not optional to have HTTPS. You're probably not familiar, but I'm a race director for a 5K in Belleville, Illinois. It's called the lawdayrun.com. And not that long ago, lawdayrun.com would not allow you to have HTTPS. To get a website from HTTP to HTTPS, you go through your domain registrar. Was that your computer, Mia?
Yeah.
We'll have to figure that out.
A heat sink just popped off.
No, that's good. That's real good. There's ways to get a website converted to HTTPS for free, but if you go through your registrar like GoDaddy or networksolutions.com, like you buy the domain name, typically what you have to do is you have to get a certificate, an SSL certificate, and typically you have to pay for it. Okay, and that payment's like $80 a year to get HTTPS. And so you can pay through your domain registrar to get HTTPS. If you've heard of Cloudflare, there's a process that you can walk through on Cloudflare. And I was able to, and this is very common, it's a service they provide. You have to change your DNS settings on your registrar to work with Cloudflare, but Cloudflare will offer you that certificate for free. So I thought that was pretty cool because you need an SSL certificate. Okay, and that kind of proves that your domain is what you say it is. You're not like phishing or spoofing. An SSL certificate is like a driver's license for a domain name. Okay, you are proving you are who you say you are. So when you buy that SSL certificate, I'm just saying Cloudflare offers it for free. If you guys ever find yourself in that scenario, it is a standard in nowadays. Your website should be HTTPS. Nonetheless, that's the first part of the URL. The next part is the domain name. You buy that. It's like $10 a year or $5 a year, or it's free, depending on where you buy it from. There's different pricing. Okay, it has to be available, right? People squat on domain names and they'll sell them to you. In fact, I read an article the other day where Tesla Cybercab, they're battling that in court because someone bought cybercab.com and they have the copyright for the company Cybercab or whatever. So Tesla, they announced the name of their Cybercab before they had the copyright. And now someone was smart enough to buy the copyright and Tesla has to sue them to try and take ownership. Why is that important? Because you buy your domain name before someone else does. Otherwise, it's a court battle. Otherwise, you have to buy it from them. And they can name their price. They could tell Elon Musk, hey, cybercab.com, $10 million, $50 million, $1 billion. They can name their price, and all they have left to do is sue them in court and try and win. Okay, but nonetheless, that's a domain name. That's a protocol, that's a domain name. Then after that, you have a path. Now in MVC, this works in a very specific way. See this orange part right here? Students details 5. You could probably guess that's your student ID of 5. This is the details page of that student. You guys have done enough of this, you could piece that together, right? Notice the key insight, .NET. The endpoint routing doesn't look for a file on the hard disk. In the old days, your route would route you to a .html file. It would literally route you to the .html file, and they would send that HTML file directly back. Okay? Instead, that route, students details 5, that actually takes you to a C# method. If you finish reading that bullet, that's going to take you to a C# method. That number 5 is going to hit the database. It's going to query the database to get the information for student 5 out of the database. And it's going to build what's called a view and send the view, the HTML, back to the browser. Okay, so what we're not doing here, like in the old days, literally your homepage would say, your old page, rankin.edu/index.html, and that would be the homepage for rankin.edu. And you could short circuit that. So if someone typed in rankin.edu, it would automatically send back index.html, right? But that's when the web got a little more sophisticated. I'm talking in the old days, you had to type in the full path, rankin.edu/index.html to get the homepage. Okay, but MVC works differently. And then after that, you got the question mark. And what comes after the question mark, you guys know, is the query string, right? Query string is non-sensitive information. You're not putting passwords in the query string because they're plain text, right? So the query string is raw text that's in the URL, and you don't put sensitive information there. All right, HTTP, dated, don't use it. HTTPS is the way you want to go. And the protocol of the internet, so if I had to say the protocol of the web, I would say HTTPS. The protocol of the web is HTTPS. The protocol suite of the internet is TCP/IP. If you guys go study networking, you will learn the OSI model. The OSI model is a networking stack of how information is sent across the wire. And that's all TCP/IP. It's a protocol suite, which means it's not one protocol, it's many protocols. And so when you start talking about GET requests and POST requests, and put requests, those are all HTTP verbs that come from the browser, that come from the front end, they hit the back end, and then the server, whether it's the application server, hits the database server. Remember, application server, keyword is Kestrel. Kestrel is the application server. Hits the database server, Microsoft SQL Server. Microsoft SQL Server is the database in our world moving forward for the next 80 days. The response typically contains status codes too, right? You guys remember those? 200s, 300s, 400s, 500s. They all have specific meanings. Okay, so you're definitely familiar with what's referred to as a round trip. Round trips are considered a little expensive. That's why single page applications that are component based like React are so popular. Because the way React works is React sends the application kind of down to the client, and the client can do a lot of the work on the front end, right? But for the client to have a full trip, a round trip, that's considered expensive. You have to go across the network, across the internet to get some data and come back. And that's a little slower than just maybe having the client do the work, right? So round trips generally speaking, you want to minimize them. So like I said, the client is going to make a request. From that request, it's going to come in and it's going to hit Kestrel. Again, that's the middle tier. And just a little bit, about Kestrel on this slide. We don't really spend much time talking about Kestrel when we're running a web application. It just kind of runs in the background. It just kind of runs. It's optimized for like Express. It's small. It can have many instances. Like you have many instances of Express running. The more clients you have, you might have many instances running of Kestrel. It's quick to boot up. It's quick to be shut down. So you see here, unlike older systems, the web server and the application server are bundled together in what's called Kestrel. This improves speed and simplifies deployment. You see, I made this slide deck in 2025. I made it after you guys left class. Instead of, if I was smart, I would have made this slideshow in 2026. Instead of December, 22nd, 2025, it should say designed for 2026. Okay, so that's a little bit, again, those are just web fundamentals. Those are web fundamentals. That's how the web works in 2025 with the inside of this .NET world a little bit. But what we're learning is called Model View Controller, MVC. And I like referring to MVC as the gold standard. MVC is the gold standard for organized code. How many times in our journey, you guys have been here for 3 semesters, how many times have you heard separations of concerns? Separation of concerns.
This is my first time.
First time.
Oh, get out of here.
Michael, separation of concerns?
Maybe vaguely.
Brody, does that ring a bell? Wah, wah,
Vaguely.
wah. Nia? Not really. Okay. The first time you should have heard about separation of concerns, and I believe he said it. I'm not saying he did anything wrong. It was Mr. Gudmestad's class. When are we separating concerns? HTML, CSS, JavaScript. 3 different languages, 3 different purposes. HTML is for your structure, your content, your structure of the page and the content that's on the page. CSS is for the design, the colors, the fonts, the spacing, the moving around, the positioning. And JavaScript makes everything dynamic. Broadly speaking, you have 3 different languages that have 3 different concerns. Separation of concerns is something that web developers always say is important. Why is it important? Because when it comes to fix something, you have to know, where do you even begin to look? Is it a problem with my content? Is it a problem with the color of the page and the positioning of things? Or is it a problem with the responsiveness and how it's responding to invalid data, where you need to do data validation? So that's what MVC is all about. We separate our concerns into these 3 areas. We've got M stands for models, V is views, and C is controllers. What are the concerns? V, the views, that's your front end. Pretty simple. So V, view, the view, when you're viewing something, you're looking at something, that's your front end. Okay? M stands for model. The model is the data. Where does the data come from? Data comes from the database. So when you're talking about separating concerns, you got the view, which is the front end. You got the model, which is the database. And you've got the controller, which is, it refers to the controller as the brain. The controller is the first line of code that runs when a user makes a request, it goes to the controller. So the controller has C# application logic in it. So I think of, your application logic, even though we want to keep our controllers not with a lot of C# logic in it. But the controller is kind of like the first line of code that runs when a request comes in and hits their controller. So you can see the controller is the brain. It takes the user's input, it talks to the model, and chooses which view to show. So it's kind of like the decision, right? It's making some logical decisions. Like, what view do I show? What data? It works with the model, so it works with the database. We'll talk more about MVC. That's really what a lot of this is. So, takeaways. What would I want you to take away from this? Number one, MVC is the gold standard for separation of concerns. Separations of concerns is a fundamental concept in web development that is always talked about when you don't want spaghetti code. Maybe you've heard of spaghetti code, when everything's just mixed together. We don't want spaghetti code. We want good separation, whether it's the front end, the application in the database, the model view controller, or whether it's the structure, the style in the dynamic HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So again, a request comes into the controller. Remember, a request comes in via the URL. So when a client navigates via a URL, in this case, students details 5, it's going to be a controller that takes command. The controller is where the request comes in. Now, a controller sounds intimidating at first, but at the end of the day, a controller is a C# class. If you guys remember C#, it's been a while. If you remember C#, C# has classes. By the way, we're going to review C# like the next couple of days. We're going to review a lot of C#. So if you don't remember C# that well, we're going to have a refresher. Okay? Before we dive too deep into this textbook. Okay? But at the end of the day, a controller is a C# class. Oh, gosh darn. One more thing I want you guys to realize about MVC. Number one, MVC, gold standard for separation of concerns for organized code. Number two, MVC has been around a long time. Check it out. Model view controller, MVC pattern. MVC pattern existed before .NET days. It goes back to the late 70s. Okay? So what's beautiful is that you can learn MVC in .NET and you can apply MVC in Java, right? It is cross ecosystem. Okay? So that's nice because the more diverse skill set you have, the better. You're casting a wider net for your job search. When the things that you learn can go cross platforms. Where did I leave off? Okay. So organized code, separation of concerns, and MVC is not new. What is new is things like Blazor and RESTful APIs. You guys just did React and RESTful APIs with Express. So you guys know a little bit about what I'm talking about. Anyways. Basically what the controller does, a request comes into the controller, it hits the database if it needs to, pulls data out of the database, and then sends that data to the view. The view kind of packages up what it needs to do and sends a web page back to the client. Okay, so a controller works with the model. The model will get the data out of the database, send the model to the view, and the view goes to the front, back to the client. So it works something like that. If you guys kind of follow that flow. The browser makes a request. The request comes into the controller. The controller works with the model to hit the database server. The data comes out of the database server back to the controller. It sends that data to the view. The view then goes to the front door back to the web browser. So again, I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead. A controller is a C# class. A model is a C# class. And a view is the only one that's not a C# class. A view has a file extension of a .cshtml. It is a combination of C# and HTML. Remember in React, you could use JSX. JSX is very similar to CSHTML. JSX, you can write JavaScript and XML or HTML all in one file. Very similar. Okay, so the model's a class. The view is a hybrid of C# and HTML and a CSHTML file extension. How come I lost my full screen here? Whatever, doesn't matter. Slide mode. I'm not in presentation mode, doesn't matter. And a controller is also just a C# class. Now, again, the controller, I already talked about this process. It's very similar. Now you're just seeing it, the journey home, the response home, you're going home, all part of the round trip, right? You're going to have a status code. You're going to have, here's a big difference. Big difference between React and MVC. MVC, it doesn't send an application back. It sends an HTML file back. The way that React worked, it was a single page application, an SPA. And it did client, it wasn't server-side rendering, this was client-side rendering. Remember how you could go from page to page in React? And it was just JavaScript on the client that was changing. Okay? That's client-side rendering. There's pros and cons to that. Remember the pros was that navigation seemed really fast and snappy. But the cons primarily were SEO, search engine optimization. Because you were kind of sending just a shell of HTML back, just like a shell page. And then to use the JavaScript to render that shell page with content. Okay, and search engines weren't good, or they're better today, but they're not that good at reading your JavaScript files to determine your page content. Okay, so React and single page applications are good at like snappy, fast pages, but they're not really good at SEO. This is the opposite. MVC is server-side rendering. You're doing all the work on the server, and you're sending an HTML file back to the client. Search engines are really good at reading HTML and understanding HTML. So you can see number 3 here, the Kestrel server packaged the HTML into an HTTP response. So you're sending an HTML file back down versus like a bundled package. There wasn't much HTML. It was a whole lot of JavaScript. Okay, so the benefits of MVC. Separation of concerns. Different team members, different teams. You work on the front end, you work on the middle, you work on the database. You can have teams, bigger teams. MVC, it works well in big corporations, big softwares, big applications. Okay, because you can split the work across teams of people and there's good separations of concerns. Because everything's broken up, you can do good testing. You have good testing on MVC because everything's broken up into different ways and different areas. Makes the app easier to maintain. The problem with MVC is there's a good learning curve. It says it requires more work to set up. Okay, and you guys will see that it's a little heavy on the lifting to kind of get into the learning curve. There's a little learning curve here. We're gonna have to get used to it. Let's take a quick break. Okay, I like this slide here because there's a lot of confusion around just something so basic, which is versioning and names. What do we call this technology? Way back when, you can see in the early 2000s, it was called the .NET framework. Okay, in the .NET framework, you can see that was Windows only, so it wasn't cross-platform. Now, Nia had a Linux machine, and Nia, we could have gone down the whole rabbit hole of VS Code and writing .NET MVC and Visual Studio Code. But we just threw you on a Windows machine, and that's fine. It's just as well. Okay, but nowadays, if you look forward, it's not just Windows. It's all new cross-platform. So you can see it started being cross-platform, meaning cross-operating system. It started being cross-platform with this version in 2016 called .NET Core. And if you look at our book, it's actually titled .NET Core. Okay, but around the time 2020, now this book was published in 23, Microsoft was moving away from the core label and they just want to call it a unified .NET. So the old language, the old tools were called .NET Framework and they were called .NET Core. Now they're trying to get away from that and just call it .NET. However, I still see a lot of .NET Core stuff around. This book is called .NET Core. I see in Visual Studio, I see stuff called .NET Core in Visual Studio. So the core label hasn't completely left us. I still see it out there. Remember I said IIS was our old web server, right? IIS was in the .NET Framework days. Internet Information Services. In 2016, .NET Core was like, hey, you could develop this and it can run on Linux and Mac and maybe Apple products. I don't quite remember. I never had to do it. Now it does. I will tell you, I've developed apps in .NET that will run on a Mac operating system. And so this whole cross-platform, cross-OS works. So you could see the core and the framework brands were retired, and now they just call it Unified.net. Now it's version 5, version 6, version 7, version 8. The latest version is version 10. So .NET version 10 is where they're at today. It hasn't been out that long, maybe I want to say less than 6 months. They come out with a new version every year. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I'm going to tell you, if you are looking for a job and you look for anything before version 5, just be aware that the company that you go to work with, if they got .NET version 4 anything, even 4.8, you're talking old technology. And so, I'm not saying turn it down, because find a job, get paid, learn, get experience. Okay, but I'm just telling you, if you got anything from 4.8 on down, just be aware you're working with some older technology. Oh, I know what's going on. I'm presenting on my other screen. That's why. I wasn't even looking at my other screen. Well, whatever. Doesn't. Okay. This is the next slide I'm going to jump to. I could probably just delete slide 16. There are 4 different programming models, 4 different tools, you could call them, that you can work with in .NET. We're going to work primarily in this class. We're going to learn a whole lot with .NET MVC. Again, whether it's .NET Core MVC, .NET MVC. That's what this majority of this class is about. We are also going to work with minimal APIs. We're also going to work with single page applications like Blazor and like React. There's also a technology called Razor Pages, which is not to be confused with, and even though it is confusing, called Razor Views. Razor Views are built into .NET MVC. Views, Razor Views. Razor Pages are an independent technology on top of MVC. And it kind of like, well, which technology do you use? And it all starts with being educated on a technology. So you have to learn the technology. And if you were to know all of these technologies, then there's ideal use cases for all of them, right? If you only know one of them, you're just going to use that one technology for everything, right? But if you were to know all 4 of these programming technologies, you would say large enterprise web apps that SEO is important, you would use MVC. Razor Pages are for your form sites, like your login pages, registration pages. You know, when you have forms, that's where Razor Pages sign. Minimal APIs. The thing about minimal APIs, they're fast. They're very lightweight. They're fast. They're micro. They're small. They're nimble. They're quick. Right? There's a lot of ways of saying the same thing. And they work really well with single page applications like Blazor and React. So if you don't have some huge piece of software, you got something smaller, kind of maybe, not a huge team of people, that's where minimal APIs and Blazor work well together. But you can do hybrid. You can have MVC apps with minimal APIs and with React or Blazor on the front end as well. They can all play nice together, and they can all integrate together. So even though I'm going to say most of this class is MVC, there are these other technologies that we will get into. Okay, and so static pages is a real old school where you just had static HTML that was sent down to the client. I'm thinking 90s and early 2000s. Dynamic pages is where we started like getting into the early and mid 2000s, where we're actually building dynamic pages based on database data that's coming back. So these dynamic pages, I'm thinking just pure MVC. If you have a pure MVC app, you're kind of in this stage with dynamic pages. But if you have an MVC app with a minimal API, a RESTful API, and maybe you put Blazor on the front end as well, that's when you can get hybrid rendering, where you get that kind of a shell of an HTML file, and then you're just using JSON back and forth between loading different content on the page. So you just get different small sections without a full page refresh. Again, but you have to bring in a single page application to do that. Now, Kestrel, the request from a client does come into Kestrel, and it does go to the controller. But before the controller takes over, there's actually a middleware pipeline, a bunch of methods that'll run that might do some logging, it might do some authentication, some authorization, some routing. And you guys have seen this before, and And if your middleware determines that you don't have permissions to see a file, then you might not ever hit this place that says your code, right? Middleware can short circuit a request. And so middleware, as we learned last semester, they're just functions that run. They have access to the request object, right? They can modify the request object. And they can oftentimes short circuit a request if a user doesn't have permissions or they're not logged in or whatever it may be. Okay, so there's middleware here too. There's middleware here on the .NET world. And there's also state management. Remember that HTTP is stateless. So every round trip, the server forgets about the client. Every single round trip. So it's really hard to maintain data, like on an Amazon shopping cart, if every time the client clicks a different link, the server forgets who you are. And so there's a couple of solutions to that, broadly speaking. You can save information in a client-side cookie on the client, right? And that's what we did in JavaScript world, is we maintain state in cookies on the client. You can also maintain state optionally on the server. And the way that's going to work on the server is what's called session state. And there's a whole chapter on session state and maintaining state in this book. Okay, but just realize that HTTP is stateless by default, and there's different ways on the client and on the server to remember who you are. Maintaining your data, maintaining the data. And you can see data, you guys know in C#, data is stored in properties and in variables. You know, it's stored in variables, basically. Okay. Now, as we're getting to the end here, I'm going to ask that you guys kind of zone back into this for me. This is an important piece, and unfortunately I've been going for a while, and I know the challenges of a long lecture and how it just drags on and you zone out, and this is an important piece, okay? And I really think you will save yourself some heartache later on if you begin to understand the next couple of slides. Okay, and you're not going to get it completely, but you'll begin to understand. Model View Controller, .NET MVC, you code by convention. There's a lot of automatic rules built in. And so yeah. We're looking at what's the difference between convention and configuration. Obviously, configuration's on the left. What does that look like on the left? It looks like
JavaScript.
does that look like JavaScript? I mean, you saw those kinds of files in the JavaScript class. That's probably why you said that. But what does that look like? Those tags, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like HTML tags, right? But that's obviously not HTML, right? So that particular file format is an XML file, right? Remember, XML has tags just like HTML. And you can put whatever you want in XML. It has specific words, it has specific meanings, just like HTML tags, but it's very customizable. Okay, that's why you could say configuration and app settings and those kinds of things. Configuration files, though. Configuration files like XML files on the left versus convention. Convention is, how would you describe convention? Convention is this is the way things work out of the box. The way MVC works out of the box It just automatically works this way. So it's conventional. It's just the normal way that it works. Does that make sense? Why I say coding by convention? Coding by convention is just how it works out of the box versus how does it work based on your configuration files. So how does it work automatically versus how do you configure it to work? All right, MVC prefers convention. So the first thing I'll point out here is that there's going to be a controllers folder, there's going to be a views folder, and there's going to be a models folder. Now you don't see on the right hand side, you don't see the models folder, but just work with me here. There's a models folder. Okay? So where do you think the controllers are going to be found? The controllers are going to be found in the controllers folder. It is so strict. If you don't put that S on controllers, there's a good chance it doesn't work. Okay? There's a chance because what? We're talking about singular versus plural. We're also talking about casing. Does the casing of the words have to match?
Yeah.
I would. Controllers, capital C, controllers, plural. Views, capital V, plural. Okay. So the home page of the website, you would need to go to the /home/index. Now the root, when you go to localhost, your routing will automatically load the home controller, the index view. But suffice to say, we're starting with the folders. Now let's look at the controllers. The folder is called the home controller. Or excuse me, the file. The controller is called home controller. Do you see the controller name home? Do you see the home folder underneath views?
Yeah.
Do you think they have to match? The home controller has to match the name of the folder underneath the views. So the controller does what? The controller works with the models and it works with the views. By default, the home controller works with the views inside of the views folder and then the home subfolder. And then the default file is called index.chtml. Remember, views have that CSHTML file extension. Those are called Razor views. So it's automatic linking based on the name. The home controller automatically linked to the index view inside of the home subfolder inside of the views. I told you there's a learning curve here, right? Seems a little complex. I'm going to give you some more examples. Okay? Notice my product controllers. Product controller, capital P, capital C. Product controller inside of the controllers folder. That product controller will automatically work with files that are underneath product. See this product right here? Product because of product controller. /product, notice the first word here is /product. This product controller automatically works with the views inside of this product folder, correct. The product controller works with the views here. The home controller works with the views here. Get it a little bit? Yeah. www just as before, all your static files in www, so your static images, your static CSS files, Like your Tailwind, guess what we're going to be doing in Chapter 3? We're doing some Tailwind. We're revisiting Tailwind.
They have Tailwind in C#?
What? Yeah. Well, Tailwind is just a front-end technology, right?
Yeah, I thought we were.
So C#, when we're talking C#, we're talking about the middle tier, really? But it's Tailwind's still on the front end. So yes, you will see Tailwind in this class. It's coming back. Okay? So wroot is the last thing here, program.cs. Program.cs is your entry point. That's where Kestrel is built. That's where your application is run. That's your Kestrel. That's your middle tier application tier, your web application. Okay? So here's a bulleted list of kind of those rules that I just went through, and you can read these. All controller classes should be stored in a folder named controllers. All models should be in a folder named models. All views should be in a folder named views. All static files are in wroot. And all controller classes should have a suffix of controller. Suffix is the second part of the word. Home controller, product controller. A suffix of controller. Right? That's the last bullet. All controller classes have a suffix of controller, capital C. This is what a model looks like. It's a C# class. Remember these auto-implemented properties? Vaguely, remember these? All right, we've got a couple people nod their heads. Right? Public class, name product, auto-implemented properties. Product ID, product name, product price.
Like you can set it and get it.
You can set it, you can get it. That's right. Here's our controller. Here's our product controller. Notice it is a C# class. It is a C# class that inherits from a parent class called controller. So child class, parent class, inheritance in C#, if you remember that. And then inside of this class, we have two methods. And the detail method and the list method. Notice the detail method takes in one parameter, takes in the detail ID. So like /products /detail /5. That's how you hit that endpoint. That's how you run this code, right? If you want to actually run this code right here, the client would provide a URL of localhost /products /detail /5. And this would be /products /list. Gets all the products, right? Gets all the products. This gets all the products. This gets a single product. And then what does it do? It sends that product to the view. The view that's in the views folder underneath the product subfolder. So views, products. This would be list.cshtml. Okay, this is what a CSHTML file looks like. Notice it kind of looks like C#. Anywhere you see the @ symbol, that's C#, but you also got HTML in there. So these are your views. This is gonna be ultimately what's kind of rendered and sent down to the client as HTML. Okay, so if you broadly don't worry too much about the code yet, because we'll get there very soon. But this is what a model looks like, this is what a controller looks like, and this is what a view looks like. Remember that a model is just a C# class. A controller is just a C# class, and a view is a hybrid of both, of C# and HTML. So here, when you hit this URL in the browser, you get back a page like this, which would read the data out of the database. Okay, and this is what the starting point of the application. You see app.run. Again, this is kind of your Kestrel app. This is your web application. Very similar to how we started with Express and we ran an Express instance. This is very similar to that. It uses routing. There's a default pattern that says the home page is the home controller with the index method inside of the home controller with a nullable ID. If there's an ID, you use it, otherwise don't. Okay, so here are some different client requests and what they resolve to. When you go to the root of the application, it's the home controller by default. Why is that? Because this says home controller by default. This says index action by default. So by default, if you just go to the root, you're going to get home index. If you just go to /home, that first slash dictates the controller name.
Shouldn't it be HTTPS, not HTTP?
Yeah, it should. It should be HTTPS. This first slash, though, this is the controller name. So /home, /product. That loads the home controller, product controller, product controller. So the first slash in the path is the name of the controller. If you leave it off, there's a default. If you leave the controller name off, the second slash is the name of the method inside of the controller. So this is the list method inside of the product controller. This is the detail method inside of the product controller. If I go back to the product controller, remember we had two methods. We had a detail method and we had a list method. Right? This is coding by convention. The user types in this, and by default, we run this method inside of this class. The user types in this, and we run this method inside of this class. The user types in this, and we run this method inside of this class. You get the idea. They type in this, they don't have to type it in. They could click a link, and it could take them there. They click a link, and it takes them there, and it runs this method inside of this class. Okay. Do you guys feel introduced to MVC?
Feel good about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
I like the structure, honestly.
Good. Everyone has their opinions. Some people like the structure and they like the syntax and the strictness. Other people are going to prefer JavaScript a little more. Honestly, like I said before, MVC is an older technology, so I'm going to be introducing some of the new stuff as I like to do, to you guys. Like web APIs and Blazor and that kind of stuff. So you'll see some new stuff as well. But this is how URLs map to controllers. Oh, and actions. Action is a synonym for method. They're called action methods. Okay. Okay, that's the end of the chapter 1 lecture. I'll stop that recording.